My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 4. I was so excited I could hardly stand it. I felt all sparkly inside, sort of scared and happy both at the same time. When lunchtime came, I could hardly force myself to eat, although of course I did, so nobody would suspect anything. Being so excited worried me. A couple of times I almost blurted something out. You know how it is when you get really interested in something and you forget what you're doing or even where you are? Well, I was thinking so hard about going to Tom Warup's and finally seeing Sam after all this time that I kept forgetting it was a secret. Once I started to say aloud, I wonder if Sam really shot anyone, and another time I began to say, maybe I ought to bring him up something to eat. Both times I caught myself. The big question was to find an excuse to get away. On a school day it would have been different. I would have just told the teacher I had to go home and help at the tavern and gone to Warup's, but I didn't want to wait until Monday. Probably Sam would be gone by then anyway. After lunch, Father sent me out to the woodlot with an axe. Although it had warmed up some, the day was cloudy and a thin layer of snow was still on the ground. From the woodlot the whole country looked white, as if it had been painted to match the church and the houses around it. I began cutting the wood, wondering if I dare sneak away to Warup's. I decided not to. After a while, Father would notice that I wasn't that there weren't any chopping sounds coming up to see what I was doing. I needed another excuse, and as I chopped, I tried to think of one. As I was thinking like that, when I first heard the horses, I straightened up, letting the axe dangle from my hand, and listened. There were a lot of them coming up from the Fairfield Road from the south, and they were coming up pretty fast. I started down the road towards the bend. They would have passed me right away. At first, all I could hear was the heavy drum roll of the hoofs. Then I began to hear voices of men shouting and the jingling of harness. Then, suddenly, they came pouring around the bend of the road into sight. It was a party of maybe 20 people, and even at a distance I could see that some of them had blue uniforms on, which meant that they were Continentals, the rebel troops. I stood back among the trees and watched them come galloping by. It was a pretty unusual thing to see a party of horsemen in Reading. They came on, and then they were swirling by, an officer wearing a sword in the lead, followed by the ordinary soldiers. Most of them had brown besses like our slug over their backs. I guess they were mostly from Fairfield trainband. The horsemen pounded on, turning the snow on the road into mud. I kept down in the shadow of the trees, but they didn't pay attention to me anyway. In a moment they had swept past. I darted through the trees to the road and looked after them. They pulled up to the tavern. The officer and 3 of the men dismounted, and then the rest galloped off. I was scared, but I was curious. I figured the officer had gone into the tavern to drink a mug of beer. I hadn't really seen many true soldiers, and I wondered what they were like. I wasn't sure if it was safe, though. What would they do if they knew Father was against the war? Still, I didn't want to be left out of the excitement, so I cut back through the woodlot and across the snowy fields so I could come up to the house from behind. I figured I would sneak in the kitchen door and listen to what was going on at first. I was still carrying the axe. It was dangerous to run with an axe, because you might fall and cut yourself, but it made me feel safer to be holding it in my hand. I went on running through the light snow, and then came up behind the barn and eased myself around it into the barnyard. I could hear the horses stamping and jingling their harnesses in front of the tavern. Somebody began to shout. The shouting was coming from inside the tavern. I darted across the barnyard and slipped into the kitchen. The door to the tap room was mostly closed, but there was a crack where it was hinged into the wall. The shouting went on. I tiptoed to the door and put my eye to the crack. Mother was standing up against the fireplace wall. There was a man in front of her, holding a rifle sideways to keep her from getting away. 2 other soldiers had hold of Father from the back, twisting his arms behind him so that he couldn't move. The officer in charge stood in front of him with a sword. "We know you have a weapon, Meeker. Where is it?" he shouted. He jabbed the sword forward as if he was going to stick it into Father. At the same time, the men holding Father gave him a jerk. I began to shake and shiver. I thought I would run some place to get help, but then I realized there wasn't any help. Probably the Patriots were trying to get the guns away from all the Tories. "I don't have it any more," Father shouted. "My loyal son Samuel stole it to go play soldier boy." The officer laughed. Come on now. I'm not going to believe that story. You're all Tories here. We want your gun. He jabbed the sword against my father's stomach. Believe it or not, as you like, father said. What do you intend to do? Run me through with that sword and leave my wife and child to fend for themselves? I will if you don't give me your weapon. He jabbed again with the sword. We know you have one. We know where all the Tory weapons in Reading are. Not everybody is willing to play the dog to the king. My father spit. There are traitors everywhere, he shouted. Watch your tongue or I'll slice it out. Oh, it scared me to hear father, yelled the rebel officer. I wanted him to just be quiet and not make a fuss, to beg even. It made me realize where Sam got his rebelliousness from, though. Father didn't like anybody to tell him what to do any more than Sam did. Oh, Father, I whispered to myself, please don't talk back. And I guess Father realized that he ought to be more quiet because he got a grip on himself and said calmly, I'm telling you the truth. My son ran off to join your army and took my gun. We have no weapons here but butcher knives. The officer looked at Father consideringly. Finally he said, I don't believe you. He raised the sword. I gasped, and the officer whipped the flat side of the blade across my father's face. My mother shrieked. My father cursed. A thin line of blood appeared on his cheek and upper lip. I knew what I had to do. I ducked out of the kitchen, dashed across the barnyard, and began to run through the pastures towards Colonel Reed's house. There was one person who knew what happened to Father Brown Bess, and he was up at Tom Warup's. Oh, I was scared. The war had finally come to Reading, and it was terrible. I guessed pretty easily what was happening, because Reading had such a reputation for being a Tory town. The rebels had decided to disarm it, at least disarm the Tories. Partly it was to get guns for themselves. Everybody knew that the rebels didn't have enough of anything, guns included, and part of the idea was to make sure that the Reading Tories wouldn't be able to do the Continentals what the Minutemen had done to the British at Concord and Lexington 6 months earlier. And I knew the rebels weren't just playing. They'd kill Father if they wanted to. So I ran uphill and down, clambering over the stone and rail fences that divided the pastures. My lungs began to burn, and even though it was cold, my face was soaked with sweat. I didn't dare stop to rest. All I could see in front of me was the rebel officer pushing a sword through my father's stomach, so I ran on, my breath roaring in my mouth, and my legs getting so weak and trembling that a few times I almost stumbled. Then I saw Tom Warup's shack, and I stopped running. There was a tiny trickle of smoke drifting up from the chimney, which I could hardly see against the gray sky. I slipped quietly around to the door. The blanket was hanging across it, so I pushed a little to the side and peered in. The fire was in a circle of stones, was practically out, but there was enough light so I could see that there was nobody in the hut but Sam. He was lying on Tom Warup's frame bed, on his stomach, with a deerskin rug over him. I could hear him softly breathe and see his back go up and down. I guess he must have walked a long way to Reading and was tired. He was a pretty good sleeper anyway. I'd slept with him all my life, and I knew he was hard to wake up, even if you had to punch him. I crept into the hut, leaving the blanket hanging over the door in case somebody should walk by, and knelt down by the bed. I was sorry to wake him up, knowing how tired he must be. I put my hand on the bed to shake it, and suddenly I realized I was touching something funny. I felt a long edge of the bed. There was something hard and long under the blanket. I put my hand under the blanket to feel it better, but I already knew it was the Brown Bess. I guess Sam had got into the habit of sleeping with it so no one would steal it. He was laying with his arms across it, with the blanket over top of both. Carefully I slid my hand down the barrel until I got to the stock, gripping it, and gave it a little pull. Sam snorted in his sleep and shook his head as if he were trying to shake a fly off his face, but he didn't wake up. I gave the gun another little pull. This time he began to talk loudly, but the words came out nonsense and I couldn't make them out. I let go of the gun and took my hand from underneath the blanket, trying to think of what to do next. Sam was pretty tired, and being a good sleeper, I figured he might be able to move his arm without waking him. When we used to sleep together, plenty of times he'd thrown his arms or leg over me in sleep, and I'd have to grunt or heave or get myself untangled from him, and he'd never wake up. I decided to take a chance. I flipped the blanket back a little until his arm and the Brown Bess were uncovered. Then I quickly bent his arm away so that it wasn't lying across the gun anymore. He snorted again, but he didn't wake up. I picked up the gun, ducked through the door of the shack, just pushing the blanket away with my hand. When I got outside, I began running across the snow-covered pastures as fast as I could go, praying that I'd get back before anything happened. Ahead of me, as far as I could see, was a trail of my own footprints in the snow, drawn like a line across the fields and fences that divided them up. I was so worried and scared that I didn't even hear Sam coming until I was across Reed's pasture and climbing over the stone wall on the other side. As I slid over the wall, I first heard a heavy thump-thump of running feet. I looked back. Sam was down at the bottom of the pasture, about 100 yards away, charging up at me as fast as he could come. He saw me look at him, but he didn't shout, for fear that somebody would hear him. I leaped over the wall and began running on as fast as I could, but I knew it was hopeless. Sam was bigger and stronger and faster than me. I looked back again. Sam was coming up to the stone wall. He didn't bother to climb it. He just cleared it in one jump and came running on. I turned and swung down to the left in the direction of the road. I didn't think Sam would follow me there for the fear of being seen. I tried to pray, but I couldn't think of any of the right words, and all I could do was whisper over my gasping breath, "Oh, please, God! Oh, please, God!" And then Sam was 10 yards behind me. "Timmy," he said in a whispery shout, "for God's sakes, Tim, give me that before you hurt yourself." I swiveled around to face him. He lunged at me, grabbing for the muzzle of the gun. He got a couple of fingers on it, but I jerked it out of his grip. He cursed and stuck his fingers in his mouth, but I could see that he had a little gash from the bayonet clip, and when I jerked it out of his fingers, I leveled Brown Bess at his stomach, and I said, "Don't come any closer, Sam, or I'll shoot you." I couldn't even hold the gun right. It was too long and too heavy for me to hold against my shoulder the way you're supposed to. I had to hold it against my hip, with one hand on the trigger and the other wrapped around the barrel. I knew that if I fired, I'd be knocked flat, but I didn't care. Sam stared at me. "Timmy, don't move, Sam." "It isn't loaded, Tim." "You're a liar." He started to step towards me. "Stand back, Sam, or I'll shoot you in the stomach." Suddenly, I began to cry, not just little tears, but big sobs, all mixed up with trying to get my breath. I felt ashamed of crying in front of Sam, and embarrassed, but it was all so terrible I couldn't stop. "Timmy, don't be crazy. It isn't loaded. Now give it to me before it gets damaged." "Jesus, Sam, Jesus. They're down there. They're going to kill Father if he doesn't give them the Brown Bess." "Who? Who's down there?" "Some Continentals, with some others from Fairfield." Then he lunged. I never knew whether I would have pulled the trigger, because the next thing I knew I was lying on the ground with Sam on top of me. He had gotten the gun. My fingers hurt, and when I looked at him, I saw that they were bleeding too, where they'd got ripped out of the trigger guard. Sam's face was dead white. "You could have shot me, you little pig, wouldn't you?" He got up off me. I sat up. "Are you all right?" he said. I jumped up. I wouldn't tell you if I wasn't, you son of a bitch. But this time, they'd probably have killed Father." "Timmy, I can't go down there." "Why not? They're supposed to be your friends." "I can't, Timmy. I'm not supposed to go down there." "What do you mean you're not supposed to go down there?" "I'm supposed to be in Danbury buying cattle. They sent me down from Cambridge with Captain Champion, the commissionary officer, because I'm from around here." "Did you run away?" "I didn't desert. I just came home for a couple of days. Captain Champion had to go over to Waterbury for something, so I decided to slip home for a day or so." "To see Betsy Reed?" "All right, so what?" Sam said. Won't you get in trouble?" "They won't catch me," Sam said. "People are always sneaking off for home for a few days. The officers don't know where half the men are a lot of the time. If they come around looking for you, one of your friends says you've sprained your ankle and you're coming along behind." "Sam, I'm scared about Father. Let's not stand here talking." He looked sort of uneasy. "He's probably all right. They've been disarming Tories in a lot of places. It's orders from Connecticut General Assembly. You don't think they're going to let the Tories keep their guns, do you?" "What'll they do to Father?" "Oh, probably just push him around a little. They don't shoot people. I saw him, Sam. He was going to stick the sword into Father. You have to go down there, Sam. You have to." "I can't, Tim. They might hang me for a deserter if they find out." All right, then, let me take the gun home and I'll give it to them. I can't do that, Tim. If I go back to camp without a weapon, they'll surely hang me. I thought about that. Oh, God, Sam, what did you have to fight for? Why didn't you just stay in college? I couldn't, Tim. How could I not go when all of my friends were going? I understood that, but I wasn't going to give in. Your family ought to be more important to you than friends. He looked embarrassed, but he didn't say anything. I think you're a coward, I said. I didn't really think that, but anybody who joined the army to fight couldn't be a coward, but I was still angry at him. No, I'm not, he said. To tell the truth, it was me who was being the coward. Now that I got calmed down a little, I was afraid of what I might find when I went home. I supposed I walked in and found Father laying on the floor with a hole in his stomach bleeding to death, or maybe Mother dead too. All right, Sam, if you're not a coward, come home with me and see if everything is all right. He thought about it. I'll go as far as the barn with you. Swiftly he loaded the brown Bess with powder from the horn slung and around his neck and a pouch of shot he had dangling from his belt, and rammed it home with the ramrod. It impressed me, the casual, easy way he did it. Did you ever kill anyone, Sam? He looked embarrassed again. We haven't done any fighting yet. We set off across the snowfields, uphill and down the way home, the way I'd come. Sam set a pretty good pace. He was hard and strong and used to it, from all the marching he had done, and I had a hard time keeping up. But I was glad to go fast because I was so worried about Father. In 15 minutes we came to our road, crossed it, and circled around the back of the house. We ducked into the barn and stared into the tavern. There was smoke coming from the chimney, but that was all. No sounds, no sign of men, no horses. Nothing happening, Sam said. Come on in with me and see, I said. It's risky, Tim. There's nobody around, I said. He stared at me. We both knew it was his job to go in because he was the older brother. All right, he said. Let's go. We darted across the barnyard and into the kitchen. And then all of a sudden there was Father standing there, a line of blood drying on his face. He and Sam stood 5 feet apart staring at each other, and then Sam turned and ran. Sam! Father shouted. Come back, Sam! But Sam raced across the barnyard and then began pounding over the snowy field towards the woodlot, the brown Bess under his arm. Father and I ran out into the barnyard and watched him go. Father knew he couldn't catch Sam. We watched him until he got to the stone wall at the edge of our pasture. He jumped on it and stood there looking back at us. Then suddenly he waved, jumped down from the wall, and disappeared into the sandlot.